Well, good morning. It's always such a privilege for me to be able to study and prepare for a morning like this. We're in this series called The Forgotten Figures. And last week, Tyler talked to us about John the Baptist and a voice in the desert. So if you haven't had a listen yet, if you weren't here last week, make sure you jump online, YouTube, socials, and catch a listen to that. This week, we're going to talk about the Innkeeper. And the question that I want you to consider is, what do you have room for? It takes us to a nativity set. Do y'all have a nativity set in your house? Yeah? Okay. Little baby Jesus in a manger. We just put ours up yesterday, confession. Our tree's finally up, but it's up. But if you consider the nativity set, I think you also have to consider why there. What about the inn? And I wonder this morning, do you have an opinion about that innkeeper? You know, that one who turned away Mary and Joseph? Like, was he so lacking in hospitality, or was he maybe doing the best that he could do? I wonder what story you've written about him. I also wonder if he had any regrets, you know, when he figured out that what happened in his barn, you know, he turned them away. Should he have kicked somebody out so there was room for Mary and Joseph? But I also want to ask, is he even really a part of the Christmas story? And spoiler alert, I don't think he is. But story has this powerful way of conveying a message of meaning, even if it is a little far off or maybe a little far-fetched. Now, for example, I watch our granddaughters, Ophelia and Leora, on Tuesdays. And so this past Tuesday, we were downstairs playing with marbles until my brains were about to rattle from the noise. And thank goodness, Ophi went to get some books. And she brought me a stack of books. Anything from Dr. Seuss to these books that we have on building Christian character. I don't know if you're familiar with these at all, but this is the one she picked first. And it's called Sammy's Gadget Galaxy. And it's a book about patience. And I know she could use some with her little sister, so I'm like, okay, this is good. Let's read this. So Sammy Stewart Spocket Springs builds this gadget galaxy, complete with 3D spaceship. It's amazing. You'll see it in the picture behind me. It's quite a contraption. But Sammy is lacking in patience. And after a series of unfortunate events, this is what it ends up looking like, because he was not patient. You see him there on the top, hanging by his britches. Now, Ophi is really intently looking at these pictures. These books have great illustration in them, and I'm wondering what she's catching. And about a half hour later, we were back upstairs again. She's playing with a Magna tiles, and this is what she created. So, I said, Ophi, is that a little gadget galaxy? Now, I hate to even say that I didn't have time, but in the moment I didn't have time. So Tuesday I'm going to redeem myself, and hopefully we will read this book again. And I want to see how much of the actual story behind the far-fetched creation she actually caught. So I want to engage her again on this, because patience is something it would be awesome if we could learn at a young age, I think. Today I want to engage the story that is behind the nativity set and the potential innkeeper who had no room. So I think there's greater meaning behind all the characters and the gifts. Oh yes, baby Jesus in a manger is paramount to the story, but I wonder what else we could uncover. So to start, I want to do a little background story and remind us that in the beginning, God, he created the earth. He created the mountains and the fields and the seas and the animals, and then humans to enjoy it with him. Sin happened. But God, being good, rescues humanity by sending his son to take on the sins of the world by assuming a human nature. He dies, and then he comes back to life again. In other words, Jesus came or was born to die, to be that ultimate sacrifice so that you and I could have life. He paid the debt of death as a sufficient exchange for all. He's fully man, fully God. And Jesus' humanity is what gave him the ability to die, but Jesus' divinity gave him the power to overcome death. So the cross wins. His resurrection provides the grounds for our resurrection, our recreation, and our renewal. And I don't know about you, but after having considered that background story, I look at baby Jesus in a manger a little bit differently. Not as much with pity for having been born in a barn, but with having this daunting task. And I'm amazed. I typically look at newborns, and there's lots of them in this space, and I just think, oh my goodness, who are you going to be? What are you going to do? And I don't really want to think about their death. But Jesus, this was his mission. He came as a baby, fully human. He came in a very humble way to then go through everything you and I could ever encounter. And to me, that makes him very relatable. His life then shows us how we then shall live and love and sacrifice and give. And then you know the story, he dies, but then he comes back to life again. This was his mission, and that is sobering. It's also very liberating and freeing, and I think very much worth celebrating. So let's dive in this morning with scripture. How many of y'all grew up, maybe still do, read Luke 2 on Christmas as you celebrate Christmas? Anybody? Anybody do that? Yeah. So I grew up, I always just remember this story being read. I'm sure my first take at it was King James Version, but we're going to go with NIV this morning. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, the picture in my mind, as that story has been read, as we have now read it to our kids, as we now try to read it with our entire family and littles, it goes something like this. Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem to do some sort of census. I imagined her on a donkey, Joseph walking. They get there just in the nick of time, and they're frantically knocking on the door of the inn because she's going into labor and we need a room. The innkeeper turns them away, but says, yeah, you can use my barn. Always imagined it to be cold because I grew up in Michiana. It's cold on December 25th. But the idea that there were animals and hay kind of warmed up the picture a little bit. And voila, there's a baby, wrapped in a cute blanket, laying in a manger. There were shepherds and stars and wise men and gifts, very expensive gifts, and gifts that I would have never wanted, but I'm like, it was a different day. And this is something that we celebrate every Christmas. Anybody else, does that line up for you? Anyone else? Or is it just me? Maybe it's just me. And I'll be honest, in the past, I haven't given this a whole lot of thought. like until about a week or so ago when I started digging into this. And I wonder that, so Jesus' birth is miraculous, right? And it's a gift to all of us, but what else did I miss? So I dug in a little bit. And just the very first part of this story that talks just so nonchalantly about them going from Nazareth to Bethlehem, well, I'd never considered how far that was, but it's about 90 miles. And most things that I do are within about a 15-mile radius of my house. 90 miles in a car is a commitment for me. Like, it's got to be a big deal. So when I think of walking 90 miles, and when I consider that that could have taken a week at almost 9 months pregnant, like that's a big deal. And they're out there in the elements, and it was the winter season. It wasn't as cold as it was this past week here. But it was the wet and cooler season. They're out in the elements, out in the wild. So that in itself is kind of a big deal, the commitment that they had to this. And the delivery scene, okay. I've had 2 babies, and I have a lot of questions about this part. And we can't talk about it here, but I have a lot of questions. Like, were they alone? How did they clean up? And how does Mary look so cute and put together in all the nativity sets? I know that wasn't me. And what about the manger scene? Again, most of the nativity sets, it looks so warm and cozy, at least our Americanized version does. But what did it really, really look like? And if we consider why he was born in a barn or a stable, the innkeeper gets a pretty bad rap. But if the inn was full, it was full, right? Like, what is he supposed to do? I've been in restaurant work. I've done that for many years, and I know that if there's not a table, there's not a table, and I can't seat you. But shouldn't somebody have given up their space for baby Jesus? So, without getting too far in the weeds, and I will tell you, there are lots of weeds to get into. As I started digging into commentary and history on this, there are a lot of possible weeds. But I'd like to explore how we can gain some understanding that perhaps gives a little more meaning to this story. A story that would convey the hospitality that actually was present, the sacrifices that were made, not of a heartless innkeeper and rejection, not a young family out in the cold and alone, but a little bit of a different scene. So a story of sacrifice and faith. Again, the simple verses 4 and 5, where it's just so matter of fact about their journey. I think it shows incredible physical sacrifice that Mary and Joseph made to take that long journey. And I think their faith had to be incredibly strong. I think it's a story of peace. Just to note, in verse 6, it says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. So there's no like frantic knocking on the door at the last minute because she's like already dilated to 4 or 10 or 9 somewhere. Like it's not that scene. There's no mad rush. And that gives me a little more peace as I look at that part of the story. Now, I don't know how long they were there before Jesus actually was born, but it also gives me peace to think that Mary had some time to rest and recuperate from that week-long journey. And I wonder if the original text was trying to convey a kataluma or a caravansary. Both of those words are interpreted to our word in, so I-N-N. Either way, if it was a caravansary, that's more like a structure kind of out in the open on the way from like here to here, from town to town. It's a structure that has a lot of little spaces in it, little rooms where travelers could just help themselves, stay there for the night, come out of the elements, get their animals out of the element, kick up their feet, and be in a safe space. If it was a kataluma, that is actually a guest room in someone's home. So Middle Eastern villagers' homes would be more designed, think of like a rectangular family room. Like this is where the family did all the things, eat, sleep. The end kind of sloped down a little bit to a couple of mangers or feeding troughs where they would like sweep their scraps. A few steps down to the end of this family room space is where they would bring their animals in at night. Like out of the cold, out of the elements, into the home, and then they could eat out of these mangers or these feeding troughs. There's a lot of conflicting arguments about which word this actually was, but I tend to think it was the latter. I think that the word in was actually a kataluma, that Jesus was placed in one of these mangers at the end of the family room because the inn, or the kataluma, guest room, was already full. These guest rooms were either like adjacent to the family room, sometimes up a level. So, if we subscribe to that, we could actually read the end of verse 7 as she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger that was in the family room, because the private guest room was full. And if we go with it being a kataluma or a guest room instead of a commercial inn, there's no innkeeper to be really upset with, right? There's actually, on the contrary, a host who was incredibly generous in opening his own family's living space. The guest room was already full, but they opened up their own family's space to Mary and Joseph. Hospitality is a big deal in their culture. And I'm guessing that if they open the door and they see Mary and Joseph, they're aware of what might happen in their home. And it likely just didn't matter to them that their family room might turn into a pediatric unit. We have an Airbnb right next door to our main home. It's actually called the Guest House on 29th, so we could kind of call it a kataluma, I suppose. And I will tell you, if I was looking out my kitchen window and I saw an almost 9-month pregnant woman walking into the guest house, followed by someone with one of those like portable birthing unit pools, I would have some questions. I'd be like, I'm not sure that I want that in there. I'm not sure what this is going to look like. I don't want to clean it up. I would have a lot of questions. So when I think about this scene and when I think about the hosts in this story, again, I think of generous hospitality and sacrifice and kindness. It's a warm and cozy space, not a cold and lonely stable or barn. So now that I may have ruined that picture of Christmas for you, don't destroy your nativity sets, but I just wonder if you can explore this now and kind of see the hospitality and the sacrifice. If we can see this nativity set more in that way versus rejection and cold. I know I hadn't. I was always amazed by Mary. That's probably one of the parts that stuck out to me, outside of the fact that the miraculous birth of Jesus part of this story. But I just saw, when I look at a nativity scene, I just see baby in a barn, the animals and the gifts, and if I gave it any thought at all, I thought the innkeeper was a dork. But this thing of Jesus' birth had a lot of details that reflect his nature. Things like obedience and sacrifice, humility, kindness, generosity. And we can see it in the characters. Again, Mary and Joseph, the obedience and sacrifice and faith to make that long, grueling journey. And then the host family who just welcomes them in even though their guest room was full. They offered what they had, and apparently they were not super concerned about any messes or inconvenience. Now, I know I may have taken some liberties here, and there are definitely a lot of conflicting thoughts and beliefs around what actually happened here. Even the accounts in Matthew and Luke are different. Some people would even say Luke made part of this story up. I don't know, but what is the story trying to convey? And that's what we need to focus on. Just like Sammy Spocket Springs' crazy galaxy and a story that's completely made up, what can we learn? This story that I've grown so accustomed to, and I've really never given a whole lot of thought to. God often works his greatest glory in the unremarkable, in the common, in the mundane, the unglamorous, even messy. Jesus was born in the dirt and grime of everyday lowly life. He wasn't born to royalty. He wasn't born in a castle to a king and a queen. I don't know why I'm pointing up. I suppose that's what I think of when I think of royalty. But when I think of royalty and I think of him cradled in a palace, that to me feels cold and distant and really kind of untouchable. But rather, Jesus is born to parents who are common, just like you and I. Oh, they were virtuous and honorable. They were obedient to God's will. But the way he came makes him accessible to you and I. And his life then goes on to show us that he's been everywhere that you and I could ever find ourselves. He's been hurt and rejected, abandoned and mocked. But I wonder, does our vanity and ambition, our envy, does it come into check when we view the Son of God coming in such a lowly, humble way in a feeding trough, like in this story? Does it make us pause and consider the importance we place on our security, on our comfort, our status, possessions? It should. It certainly should. Because if Jesus can be born in such a humble way and still live such an impactful life to show us how then we should live, knowing he was born to die, what excuse do we have? And just like the hosts of the home where the Cataluma or the inn was full, and they still welcomed Mary and Joseph into their family room, Jesus welcomes us into his story. We find ourselves within a story of God's grand recreation project, invited to delight in God's goodness. And we're called, every single one of us, we are called to participate in God's work of renewal. It's like he's so generous and he's saying, come as you are, who you are, wherever you are, and let's do this. You don't need a neat and tidy story or life to begin. So today, let's let the innkeeper off the hook, set judgment aside. Let the details of this birth, this nativity scene, kind of be as they may. Oh, let's celebrate this story of his birth and his humble beginnings. But friends, let's emulate his life. This story of him as a baby in a manger is just the beginning. I think in this story, Jesus is saying, I don't care where you're from. I don't care who your parents are. Don't get caught up in those details. But where are you going? What will you do with this life you have? Nothing disqualifies you. Jesus comes straight into our messy human lives, and he shows us how to love, and he shows us how to live without excuses, without offense. And he comes with a promise to take away the guilt and the shame and the fear, and to restore us to life. So what do we do with all of this? I actually don't make New Year's resolutions. I'm not a huge fan. But as a year comes to a close and I begin to look at another year, it causes me to pause and kind of inventory what I could do differently to add more meaning to my life, to be more impactful, to better walk out this way of Jesus, so that other people will be curious and maybe want to join me, to not get into that groove of same old, and feel like there's no purpose, to not just look at the nativity set without pondering the life of Jesus, to ponder the nature of Christ that is evident in the story. So I wonder if you'll join me. Join me in this pausing and reflecting. And I warn you, it's going to take some sacrifice. But the question I'd love for you to explore is, what do you need to make room for in 2025? Does something need to get kicked out so you have room? Because if we know that Jesus wants to take up residence with us, and we do, unlike the infamous innkeeper who had no idea that Jesus wanted to take up residence in his inn, we know. And if we know that Jesus lived his life as an example for us to follow, despite the brokenness we live in, despite the brokenness we experience, what does he want to do? What do we need to make room for? And so sometimes we have to explore what has to go. What has to go so that you have room for people and relationships and community, for hospitality, for caring for other people, engaging other people. What has to go so that you can give to the less fortunate, for generosity and caring for others? What has to go so that you have the space, the time for listening to and seeking the voice of God, so that you know your next steps of obedience and where he wants you? What has to go so that you have time for self-care, for therapy, for healing? What has to go so that you have courage to extend forgiveness, to let go of offense, to love unconditionally? I know we're all busy. And I think this thing of being busy and having a really full schedule is really glamorized. And I personally think that's the first thing that has to go. We need to slow down, maybe even stop, hit the pause button so that we can look at our stories. Is our life story playing out the way that we want it to? What is the mission, and is it happening? Can people see it? Or could someone easily misinterpret our heart, our intentions and motives? My car plates say Refresh, which is the name of my salon. And I named it that because that's what I want people to experience when they come in to the salon to get their hair done. I want them to feel refreshed. I want them to feel Jesus, even if they don't know that that's what it is. So when I'm on my journey to work, which is 12 minutes from my house, I get to drive on 20. Y'all know my love-hate relationship with US 20. But I am very aware that those plates are on my car when I'm tempted to cut somebody off. I'm like, shoot, I need to behave myself, because what if they Google that and they never want to come to my salon? Then I've defeated the purpose. So am I representing what I'm broadcasting? Or should my plates just say idiot? I have gotten rid of those plates, by the way. That's for a whole nother story. If you want to ask me about it, you can. Becky, Eli, you guys want to come up here? Would you stand with me as we kind of wrap this up this morning? But I want to ask you all that question as well. Are you representing what you're broadcasting? Is your story clear? I think the story of Jesus was clear. And if your story is as clear as Jesus, you welcome others in, no matter who they are, what their background is. You see others and you take time for them. You love unconditionally. You're generous with your time, your money, your resources. You're honest and trustworthy, kind and compassionate. You treat your spouse, your coworkers, your boss with respect and kindness. Your life actually represents the God you say you serve, and it points people to him. Is that your story this morning? Or would it be best if you just didn't claim to follow Jesus? Like if your plate said, I love Jesus, would people want to follow you and be curious? So what's your story this morning, and what is it that you can do? Maybe what is it that you need to do to adjust in 2025 as we keep not just this miraculous birth of Jesus in focus, but also his life, this gift of his life that he modeled for us, and his death and his resurrection. Let's pray. God, this morning we're so grateful for the example that you are, that the life you lived when you came as a human shows us how then we shall live. God, as we consider our next steps of obedience, and as we consider the adjustments that we need to make looking at a new year, God, I pray that you would show us again, like with fresh eyes, what it is that you want to do in us and through us, and the places that you need us to go, and the people you need us to see. Thank you for your sacrifice, for your love, and the nature that you emulate. We love you. Amen.